I was Private First Class Tony Castillo, United States Marine Corps, 1st Marine Division, and I'm the one they called the crazy bastard who held Henderson Field. Though I prefer to think of myself as just a Marine who did his job on the night of October 24, 1942, when 200 Japanese soldiers came at my position in a Banzai charge and I was the only thing standing between them and the airfield that would determine who controlled Guadalcanal, and I held that position for 4 hours and 37 minutes with nothing but my Browning M1917 water-cooled machine gun and all the ammunition I could carry. And when dawn came there were 93 dead Japanese soldiers in front of my position and I was still alive, somehow, though I'd been wounded twice and was so deaf from the gunfire that I couldn't hear properly for 3 weeks afterward, and that night changed the course of the battle for Guadalcanal. Though I didn't know it at the time, I just knew that if I abandoned my position the Japanese would take the airfield and our aircraft couldn't land and we'd lose the island and probably the entire Solomon Islands campaign. So I stayed and I fired my machine gun until the barrel glowed red hot and I had to pour water on it to cool it down. And I killed so many men that night that I still see their faces 60 years later, still hear their screams mixed with the rattle of my machine gun. Still wake up sometimes thinking I'm back in that fighting hole with tracers lighting up the jungle and mortar rounds exploding around me. I'd been on Guadalcanal since August 7, 1942, when we made the first American amphibious landing of the war, and I was 19 years old and from El Paso, Texas. And I joined the Marines in January 1941 because I wanted adventure and because jobs were scarce during the Depression and because my father had been in the Army during World War I and I wanted to prove I was as tough as he'd been. And I'd gone through boot camp at San Diego and then gotten assigned to the 1st Marine Division. And we trained for amphibious assaults in North Carolina. And then suddenly we were on ships heading toward the Solomon Islands to take an airfield the Japanese were building. And nobody told us much about where we were going or what we'd face, just that we needed to take this airfield before the Japanese could complete it and use it to threaten the supply lines between America and Australia. The landing itself was easy. We hit the beach at Guadalcanal expecting heavy resistance and found almost nothing. The Japanese construction workers and the small garrison just retreated into the jungle, and we took the airfield on the first day and named it Henderson Field after a Marine pilot who'd been killed at Midway. And we thought the hard part was over, but we were wrong, so wrong. Because the Japanese weren't going to let us keep that airfield without a fight, and for the next 4 months they sent reinforcements down the Tokyo Express, destroyers and cruisers that would race down at night and land troops and supplies and shell our positions before racing back north before our aircraft could catch them in daylight, and we were constantly under attack, constantly hungry because supplies were scarce, constantly wet because Guadalcanal had rain almost every day, and constantly afraid because the Japanese would infiltrate our lines at night, and you never knew if the guy moving in the darkness was your buddy going to the latrine or a Japanese soldier with a bayonet. By October 1942 we'd been on the island for nearly 3 months and we were worn down, exhausted, sick with malaria and dysentery and dengue fever, living on reduced rations because supply ships couldn't always get through, and the Japanese had been building up forces for a major offensive to retake Henderson Field, and we knew they were out there in the jungle, thousands of them, preparing for an assault. And our commanders had placed us in defensive positions around the airfield perimeter. And my position was on the southern edge of the airfield, in a fighting hole with my machine gun pointing toward the jungle about 200 yards away, and my assistant gunner was a kid from Ohio named Jimmy Chin whose parents had emigrated from China, and Jimmy and I had been together since training. We'd become good friends despite me being Mexican-American and him being Chinese-American. Both of us minorities in a corps that was overwhelmingly white, and we'd learned to trust each other completely, and when you're in combat that trust is more valuable than anything else, knowing that your buddy will be there when things get bad, that he won't run or freeze or let you down. On the afternoon of October 24th our company commander, Captain Lewis, came around to check our positions and he told us that intelligence expected a major Japanese attack that night, probably multiple attacks from different directions trying to overwhelm our defenses and take the airfield. And he said that if any position got overrun we couldn't afford to retreat because giving up any ground might let the Japanese bring artillery within range of the airfield, and Henderson Field was everything. It was the reason we were on this miserable island. It was the only place American aircraft could land between Hawaii and Australia. It was the key to controlling the Solomons and stopping the Japanese advance southward. And he looked at me and Jimmy and he said, "I'm counting on you two to hold this position no matter what comes at you." And we said, "Yes, sir, because that's what you say," and he moved on to the next position, and Jimmy looked at me and said, "No matter what means no matter what." "Right?" And I said, "Right." And we both knew what that meant. It meant we'd die in this hole before we'd retreat, and I was scared but also determined, because I'd been raised to believe that you don't quit, you don't back down, you do your duty even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, and this was going to be hard. We spent the late afternoon checking our ammunition. We had 8 cans of .30-06 ammunition for the machine gun, each can holding 250 rounds on a fabric belt, so 2,000 rounds total, and I had my M1 Garand rifle as backup with 8 extra clips, and Jimmy had his rifle and a bag full of hand grenades, and we had 2 canteens of water each and some C-ration cans and nothing else. And we sat in our fighting hole as the sun went down, and the jungle got dark and the usual evening sounds started, insects and birds and the rustle of wind in the palm trees, and I remember thinking about my family back in El Paso, my mother and father and my 2 younger sisters, and wondering if I'd ever see them again, and I said a prayer, asking God to give me strength and courage and steady hands, and then I focused on my machine gun, checking it one more time, making sure the belt was feeding properly, making sure the water in the cooling jacket was full, because that machine gun was my responsibility and possibly the difference between life and death for everyone on this part of the perimeter. The attack started at 10:47 p.m. I remember looking at my watch when we heard the first mortars, Japanese mortars falling on our positions, and then I heard rifle fire from our left flank, which meant they were hitting multiple positions simultaneously, and then I heard something that made my blood run cold, voices in the jungle in front of us, Japanese voices, lots of them. And I could see movement in the darkness about 100 yards out, shadows moving between the trees, and I called out to Jimmy, "Here they come!" And I pressed the butterfly trigger on the machine gun and it roared to life, tracers lighting up the jungle, and I swept the gun back and forth across the tree line, firing in short bursts the way I'd been trained, and I saw Japanese soldiers falling, saw muzzle flashes as they returned fire, and bullets were cracking past my head and hitting the sandbags around our position, and Jimmy was firing his rifle at targets I couldn't see. And the noise was incredible. Overwhelming, machine gun fire and rifle fire and explosions and screaming, and I just kept firing, kept the gun moving, kept the bullets going downrange, because if I stopped firing they'd rush us and we'd be overrun. The first assault lasted maybe 20 minutes though it felt like hours, and when they pulled back there were bodies in front of our position, maybe 15 or 20 dead Japanese soldiers, and I could hear wounded men crying out in the darkness, and I was shaking with adrenaline, my hands trembling as I reloaded the machine gun with a fresh ammunition belt, and Jimmy was wounded, a bullet had grazed his shoulder. Just a flesh wound but it was bleeding, and I helped him wrap it with a bandage from our medical kit, and he said, "That was just the first wave, they'll come again." And he was right. About 15 minutes later we heard them coming again, more voices in the jungle, and this time they came in greater numbers, maybe 80 or 100 Japanese soldiers charging across that 200 yards of open ground between the jungle and our position, and I opened fire and the machine gun just ate through ammunition, belt after belt, and I was firing almost continuously now, no time for short disciplined bursts, just sustained fire trying to cut down as many attackers as possible, and they were so close I could see their faces in the muzzle flashes, young men mostly, probably as scared as I was, but they kept coming, kept charging forward even as their comrades fell around them, and some of them got within 30 yards of our position before the weight of fire cut them down, and Jimmy was throwing grenades now, pulling the pins and hurling them toward the Japanese soldiers. Explosions adding to the chaos, and my machine gun barrel was glowing red-hot. I could see it in the darkness, and I had to pour water from my canteen onto the barrel to cool it down, and the water hissed and steamed, and I kept firing, and finally this second wave broke and fell back, and there were so many bodies now, So many dead men lying in front of our position, and I'd killed them. I'd killed dozens of men in the last hour. And I should have felt something, guilt or horror or remorse. But all I felt was determination to survive, to keep my position, to do my job. Jimmy was hit again during the third assault, a Japanese bullet that went through his left leg, and he collapsed in the fighting hole, and I tried to help him, but he pushed me away and said, "Keep firing, keep that gun going." And he dragged himself to the corner of the hole and reloaded his rifle one-handed and kept shooting even though he was losing blood, and I went back to the machine gun and fired at the next wave of Japanese soldiers. And this assault was different, more organized. They were using mortar fire to suppress us while infantry advanced in short rushes, and I had to keep moving the gun to hit different targets, and bullets were hitting all around our position, some of them hitting the sandbags, some of them cracking past my head so close I could feel the air pressure, and I got hit in the left arm, a burning sensation like someone had touched me with a hot poker, and I looked down and saw blood soaking my sleeve. But I couldn't stop to deal with it, I just kept firing, and the machine gun jammed, the belt had twisted and the gun stopped feeding, and my heart froze because a jammed gun meant death, meant the Japanese would overrun us. But I'd trained for this, I'd practiced clearing jams 1,000 times, and my hands moved automatically, opening the feed cover, clearing the jam, closing the cover, pulling the charging handle, and the gun was firing again. Maybe 3 seconds of downtime, but it felt like an eternity, and I swept the gun across the attackers and cut down 6 or 7 men who had gotten close while the gun was jammed, and I realized that I was crying, tears running down my face. But I wasn't stopping, wasn't even slowing down, just crying and firing and loading and firing again. The fourth and fifth assaults blurred together in my memory. It was just constant firing, constant reloading, constant movement of targets coming at me through the darkness, and I was down to my last 2 ammunition cans, 500 rounds left, and I knew I had to conserve ammunition, but I also knew that if I didn't fire enough the Japanese would overrun us, and it was a terrible calculation. Trying to balance immediate survival against ammunition sustainability, and I decided that immediate survival was more important, that running out of ammunition while still alive was better than conserving ammunition while dead, so I kept firing at the same rate, and Japanese soldiers kept falling, and I was hit again, this time in the right thigh, and the pain was sharp and intense, but I couldn't stop, couldn't take time to bandage it, I just kept firing, and Jimmy was unconscious now. He'd passed out from blood loss, and I was alone. One Marine against what seemed like hundreds of Japanese soldiers, and I thought about Captain Lewis saying, "Hold this position no matter what." And I thought about Henderson Field behind me and all the other Marines depending on that airfield, and I thought about my family back home and how proud my father would be if I held my position, and I kept firing, kept the machine gun chattering away, kept the bullets going downrange, and bodies kept falling in front of my position, and the pile of dead was so high now that it was providing cover for the living attackers, and I had to fire at muzzle flashes and movement rather than clear targets, and dawn seemed impossibly far away, like it would never come, like I was trapped in an eternal night of violence and death. The final assault came around 3 a.m., and I was down to my last ammunition can, 250 rounds, and I could see Japanese soldiers massing in the treeline, preparing for one more push, and I knew this was probably it. I was going to die here in this fighting hole on Guadalcanal, and I made peace with that. I accepted it, and I decided that if I was going to die I'd take as many of them with me as possible. And I waited until they started their charge, and then I opened fire with the last of my ammunition, firing in long sustained bursts now because conservation didn't matter anymore. Just killing as many attackers as possible, and the machine gun was so hot that the water in the cooling jacket was boiling, I could hear it bubbling, and the gun was firing slower now because the heat was affecting the mechanism, but it was still firing, still spitting out bullets, and Japanese soldiers were falling. And some of them got within 20 yards of my position, and I grabbed Jimmy's rifle and fired at them, single shots, carefully aimed despite my exhaustion and my wounds. And I picked up grenades and threw them, and I was moving in a kind of desperate frenzy, firing and throwing and moving, and then suddenly it was quiet. The Japanese had pulled back again, and I waited for the next assault, But it didn't come, and the sky was getting lighter in the east, dawn was approaching, and I realized I'd made it. I'd survived the night, I'd held my position. Captain Lewis and a squad of Marines reached my position about 20 minutes after dawn, and they found me sitting in the fighting hole with my machine gun, covered in blood from 3 wounds, surrounded by empty ammunition cans and spent shell casings, with Jimmy unconscious beside me and 93 dead Japanese soldiers in front of the position, and the captain just stood there staring at the scene, and he said, "Jesus Christ, Castillo, what did you do?" And I said, "I held the position, sir, like you ordered." And he organized stretcher bearers to take Jimmy to the aid station, and he called for a medic to treat my wounds, but I wouldn't leave until I'd cleaned and checked my machine gun, because that gun had saved my life and I owed it that respect, and I sat there removing the barrel and cleaning the mechanism while a medic bandaged my wounds, and other Marines were examining the bodies in front of my position, counting them, taking photographs. And I heard someone say, "One man did this? One Marine held against 200 Japs?" And I wanted to say that Jimmy had helped, that he'd fought beside me until he passed out, that I hadn't been alone, but I was too tired to speak, too exhausted to do anything but sit there with my machine gun. They gave me the Navy Cross for that night, though I didn't find out until weeks later because I was in the hospital recovering from my wounds and from malaria that hit me a few days after the battle, and the citation said I'd displayed extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty, and held a critical defensive position against overwhelming enemy forces. And they wanted me to go back to the States for a war bond tour, wanted me to give speeches and be photographed and help with recruiting, but I refused because my war wasn't over yet. Jimmy was still recovering from his wounds and I wasn't going to leave Guadalcanal until he could leave with me, and besides, my squad needed me, my platoon needed me, and I wasn't going to abandon them for some publicity tour. Jimmy recovered and we both got sent back to the States in February 1943 after the Japanese evacuated Guadalcanal and the campaign was over, and we spent a month in the hospital in San Diego, and then we did go on that war bond tour, traveling around the country giving talks about the fighting on Guadalcanal, and people would ask me how I'd managed to hold that position alone. What I was thinking during those 4 hours, how I found the courage to keep fighting, and I never had a good answer. Because I hadn't felt particularly courageous, I just felt determined, and sometimes I'd say that I fought for the Marines beside me, for guys like Jimmy who'd been wounded but kept fighting, for Captain Lewis who'd trusted me to hold that position, and sometimes I'd say I fought for the airfield and the bigger strategic picture, and sometimes I'd say I fought because quitting would have dishonored my family and my Marine Corps training. But the truth was probably simpler than any of that. I fought because stopping would have meant dying, and I wanted to live, wanted to see my family again, wanted to have a future, and the only way to get that future was to keep firing my machine gun no matter how scared I was or how many men I had to kill, and that's what I did. I chose life over death, survival over surrender, and I got lucky, because 93 Japanese soldiers died that night and I lived. And there's no skill or honor or heroism that fully explains why I survived and they didn't, just luck and a reliable machine gun, and enough ammunition to keep firing until dawn. I went back to combat in 1944, fought at Peleliu and then Okinawa, and I survived both campaigns though Peleliu was worse than Guadalcanal in some ways, the heat and the caves and the Japanese defenders who'd learned to defend in depth, and Okinawa was a nightmare that lasted for 82 days. But I never again faced a night like October 24, 1942. When I held Henderson Field against 200 Japanese soldiers, and I never wanted to, because that night used up something inside me, some reserve of strength or courage or sanity that I've never gotten back, and I've spent the last 60 years thinking about those 93 men I killed, wondering about their families and their lives before the war, and whether they'd wanted to be soldiers or had been conscripted like so many young men in that war, and I know they would have killed me if they could. I know that war doesn't leave room for mercy or second thoughts. But I still see their faces sometimes, still wake up in the middle of the night hearing that machine gun and smelling the smoke and feeling the vibration of the gun as it fired, and my wife Sarah, who I married in 1946, she knows not to wake me when I'm having those dreams, she just waits for me to come back on my own, and I do, eventually, I come back from Guadalcanal to our bedroom in El Paso, and I remember that I survived, that I came home. That I got to have this life with Sarah and our 3 children and 7 grandchildren, and I'm grateful for every day, even the hard ones, because 93 men died that night so that I could live, and I owe it to them to make my life count for something, to be worthy of the chance I was given, and I've tried to do that, I really have, though I'm not sure I've succeeded. Peleliu was September 1944, a tiny island that was supposed to take a few days but turned into a month of hell, and the Japanese had built elaborate cave systems in the rocky coral ridges, and we had to dig them out cave by cave, bunker by bunker, and the heat was incredible, over 110 degrees every day, and men were dropping from heat exhaustion faster than from Japanese bullets. And I remember thinking that at least on Guadalcanal we'd had rain and jungle and some shade, but Peleliu was exposed and barren, and the sun beat down on us relentlessly, and we took 60% casualties in the 1st Marine Division during that campaign, which was worse than Guadalcanal, and I got hit again, shrapnel in my back from a mortar round, and I was evacuated to a hospital ship and missed the final weeks of fighting, and I was almost grateful for the wound because it got me off that island. And I felt guilty about feeling grateful because my buddies were still fighting and dying while I was on a clean hospital ship with real beds and hot food, and that guilt has stayed with me, the sense that I should have been there with them, that getting wounded and evacuated was somehow letting them down, even though I know rationally that I had no control over where that mortar round landed. But survivor's guilt isn't rational, it doesn't respond to logic, it just sits there in your chest like a weight that never goes away. Okinawa was April to June 1945, and by that point I'd been in the Pacific for nearly 3 years, and I was exhausted, physically and mentally, and I'd been promoted to sergeant, and I was leading a squad, responsible for 12 men, and that responsibility weighed on me because I knew that my decisions could get them killed, and I tried to be careful, tried to be smart, tried to keep them alive. But 7 of the 12 men in my squad were killed or wounded during the Okinawa campaign, and I still remember their names, Tommy Garcia and Jim Kowalski and Pete Chin, who'd been with me since Guadalcanal, and Eddie Morrison, who'd held me while I bled on Henderson Field, and Eddie was killed by a Japanese sniper on May 18th, shot through the head while we were advancing on Shuri Castle, and I held him while he died just like he'd held me 3 years earlier, and the circle closed, and I thought about how many times we'd saved each other, how many close calls we'd survived together, and then a random bullet from a sniper we never even saw ended him in an instant, and I carried his body back to our lines and I sat with him until the graves registration people came, and I took his dog tags and his personal effects to send back to his family in Tennessee, and I wrote a letter to his mother telling her that Eddie had been a hero, that he'd saved my life multiple times, that he'd been the best Marine I ever served with, and I meant every word, but I also knew that no letter could ease her grief. No words could bring her son back, and writing that letter was one of the hardest things I've ever done, harder in some ways than combat, because in combat you can act on instinct and training, but writing that letter required finding words for something that had no words, trying to make sense of senseless death, trying to offer comfort when there was no comfort to be had.